My name is Eric Havlock. I'm with Alaska Housing Finance Corporation. I'm here today a little bit about multifamily financing options, or what Alaska Housing has in our bucket of authority, if you will, for financing multifamily housing. I want to share information with you today, so I encourage you to ask questions. If I get drilled down into a topic and you start to glass up, raise your hand and stop me and say, what do you mean by that? Or can you expand on that or explain that a little more? And sometimes when I get going a little fast. And so, hey, whoa, Eric, slow down a little bit. Can you say that again? That's fine. I don't mind being interrupted, and I'm happy, again, to share information with you today so we can take the most out of this session that we can. Also, I'm going to start a little up high with some general information to give you an idea of what multifamily is, and then we're going to drill down into the particulars on putting a file together to submit to Alaska Housing to try to get financing approval, to apply for financing approval. And so if that's not your bailiwick, that's fine. Feel free, you can get up and go out and leave. You're not going to break my heart if you have to leave partway through. So stay around for the part that interests you. Please, please ask questions. Interrupt me if I get going too fast. And here we go. So the multifamily options that Alaska Housing offers are outlined on this slide, and everyone can have a handout, or there's some out there. And so I'm going to go over them briefly and then drill into a couple of what I think are more pertinent for what we're facing here in the next 3 to 4 years. Our Assistance Provider Loan Program is financing for small assisted living homes, and this is typically single-family dwellings or duplexes that are licensed by the state of Alaska for the assistance of residents with their activities of daily life. So assisted living, I think folks are kind of familiar with the concept. There's not a lot of financing options because it's sort of caught in that middle between residential and commercial. Who does it? Well, we do. That's why we offer the program. One of the benefits of the program is that it does offer 100% financing without mortgage insurance on your first home. The idea of the program, or that benefit, if you will, or incentive, is to encourage that home care alliance in the small home setting. Another program we have is the Multifamily Special Needs and Congregate Housing Program, which is a mouthful, I realize, but kindly remember we're a creature of statute. So Alaska Housing was created by the law, basically by the legislature, and when they name a program or name a purpose, we're kind of married to that name. We can't just make up our own names. So what this program does is a direct lending program from Alaska Housing where you'd apply directly to us for rental housing financing that targets special needs. So that would be affordable housing or senior housing, or again, assisted living is a component under that program. And I'll drill down into that one a little deeper later, as well as talk about some of the subsidies, incentive subsidies for the development of that housing that make it work. And the reason I say make it work is because, and I'll have this repeated theme all day, is the whole, what I do is loans, okay? I'm not into grants, so I don't do that. It's a whole different department. And so with a loan, we have this expectation of repayment. So my question is always going to be, how am I going to get repaid on this loan? Because I'm making the loan for with public money, essentially, right? And so it's for the betterment of Alaskans with public money. And so how am I going to get repaid becomes an important recurring question. The loan purchase program is the one I'm going to go into most in depth. This is where Alaska Housing acts as an investor, like a Fannie Mae or a Freddie Mac. And we are there to provide the capital so the local institutions can make these loans and then sell them to us. And so again, it's similar to Fannie or Freddie, and I have a lot of slides on the loan purchase program. The Homeowners Association loan program, I like it myself. It's a loan to an active homeowners association. And what differentiates it from conventional financing is that we don't put a lien on the individual units. What we're doing is lending to the association. And when you think about it, condominium ownership can be an entry-level form of ownership for folks, and perhaps they have a 97% loan-to-value loan on that condo, and if they get hit with an assessment because all the sill plates rotted out in the building, all of a sudden they're underwater on their condo. They can't sell it, and so they can't move on, they can't relocate. And so what we do is we make financing available under this program to the association for common area repairs or to boost reserves. If there's a reserve issue where, let's say the roof leaked and they had to fix the roof and it liquidated the reserves, and other financial investors aren't willing to finance units in there because the reserves are underfunded, we can give the association a loan to boost those reserves back up to make it eligible for other investor financing. And that's a 15-year loan product. And when you think about it, 15 years is probably about right because we're doing common area improvements, and that's usually the economic life of that. So that's the Homeowners Association program. I'll talk a little bit more about that. We also have what's called the Loans to Sponsors program, and this is basically a block loan to entities that want to create their own loan program. Alaska Housing, we're centered in Anchorage, and we are Alaska Housing, not Anchorage Housing. And so we want to make sure that the expertise that's out there in the field, such as this community and other communities, is able to maybe reach out to their clientele by borrowing funds and then re-lending it. It is for home ownership. And so that means that triggers all the federal requirements. So you have to have the licensed originator, you have to have the approved servicer by us, approved servicer by us under this program. And those interest rates run between 2.5% to 3.5% depending on the dollar volume borrowed. Okay, so just in your mind, loan to sponsor is sort of a block loan for an entity to develop their own loan program for home ownership. The GOAL program is greater opportunities for affordable living. That's those building incentives I was talking about. And the reason that Alaska Housing had, well, there's a couple reasons. Most of it is it's federal money or federal tax credits, or there is capital funds from the state of Alaska. Now, everybody in the room, I'm pretty sure, knows we don't have a capital budget yet, so we don't have the funding in place for FY18 yet for these programs. But we're going ahead and we're taking the applications subject to the appropriated funding, with the exception of the low-income housing tax credit program. And I have an example later in the presentation that shows how one of those deals go together. In a nutshell, they're basically tax credits. In other words, credits against a federal income tax liability that are allocated through Alaska Housing based on a competitive bid process. So if you have the best project that runs the cheapest and is efficient to construct, then that one's going to score higher than giant common areas that are non-revenue areas and things like that. So, and we'll talk about an example of one of those projects just to give you an idea of how when the tax credits come in, it's not enough. And the loan financing comes in, it's not enough. And so you have to layer other sources of funding to make these projects work. The last one that I have up on the slide is the Alaska Energy Efficiency Revolving Loan Program. Again, a mouthful of words that basically means that we have authority to make loans for the university, for the state of Alaska or subsidiaries of the state, or cities or municipalities within the state for energy efficiency improvements to public buildings. Okay, so if you want to upgrade the boiler to lower utility costs, all kinds of things like that. When you're putting a new roof on, you think, oh, a roof sounds like a capital repair. Well, nowadays it's an energy efficiency repair because the science behind roof design has come along so much that we call that, it makes your unit or your building more energy efficient. And so we have affordable loans. I call them affordable because that's what it said in the statute that gave us the authority to do it. I'll give you an example. This week the rate's 4% on a 15-year loan. And so we have those loans available for those three identified entities to make energy efficiency improvements to public buildings. And I'll run off track just a little bit because to me this sounds like a great idea. I was really excited when we got this authority 6 years ago. And it was like, wow, we're going to be able to go and help these communities lower their costs and pass utility savings. Wow, we got one loan so far in 6 years. And part of what we've run into is the complexity of public entities borrowing when they're used to grants or appropriation or their own revenue generation, i.e. Property taxes or sales tax. And so we have one. It was a combination, and it was in the Galena, and it was to help they converted from an old steam heat system to a biofuel system with hot water instead of steam. And so we were able to work with them to finance the retrofit of the boiler was done by another state agency with an appropriation, oddly enough. But they financed with us to do the distribution lines to the Gila School. And it substantially lowers their costs. And then these loans are repaid. Remember, I do loans. So they are repaid through the energy savings. In other words, if you're paying $10 today for your fuel bill, and when you put in a high efficiency boiler, you're going to pay $5, technically you're saving $5, and that revenue stream can be directed towards debt service. And then after the loan's paid off, then you have that lower revenue demand on you, or the lower expense demand for utilities that can be used however you want. And when you think about how cities and governments budget, it makes sense that would be targeted as a revenue stream instead of just a savings, because you got to pay for it somehow to get there. So that's a brief, quick overview of the programs that we have to offer through the multifamily section, and then that's what I do. Again, my name's Eric Havelock. I've worked for Alaska Housing since the mid-90s, and I've been doing the multifamily since about the year 2000. And so I've worked with these programs. I've tried to keep them as stable as possible so there's not a change memo. So if you pick up a file 6 months from now, I can say, hey, you know, the program hasn't changed. It's just like you remember it. And so I'll talk about how to do that to us. And so why is Alaska Housing in the multifamily business? Well, in the early 90s, we have the authority to issue tax-exempt bonds. Okay, we get bond cap approval from the bond bank, and then we can issue bonds, which in the 90s had a much lower interest rate than the taxable rates. Today, that is very compressed, and there's not that much advantage with that tool. But that's how we started. We started doing bond issuances for the development of affordable housing. And then we were approached by lenders who said, you know, why don't you invest in these? You've got a couple loans, they're performing, you know how they work, because ADA's not doing them. They say that's residential housing. Rental apartments are residential housing. So our sister agency, ADA, wasn't doing apartments. We said, okay, we'll do like their program, and we did a participation with them. And so that worked for about a year, and the banks came back and said, why don't you buy all the loans? And we said, okay. And so now it's a 100% participation program. In other words, we buy 100% of the program, or of the loan amount, for financing the multifamily. And that's that loan purchase program I'm talking to you about, where we're acting as the investor or a secondary market, so there's affordable capital in the Alaska market for the development or financing of rental housing. In 2011, we added the balloon feature. And what that means is we do 30-year fixed rate stuff, right? Because that's what our bonds are tied to. Alaska Housing goes to Wall Street to get our money. We're a self-supporting agency. We don't get funding except through our capital budget. Our operating budget's all covered by what we make on our loans. And the way we get our money to buy these loans is we go to Wall Street and sell general obligation bonds. And they're the general obligation of Alaska Housing Finance, not the state of Alaska. We're a political subdivision. So when Alaska Housing goes to the bonds markets, we're not using the state's credit, we're using our credit. And so we were approached in 2011, and they said, you know, this 30-year fixed rate stuff works great, but that's not what the investor market is. That's not what people that are financing apartment buildings are using. They're looking at a shorter term product. So here's your first question. Why would they be interested in a shorter term product? Back to interest rates. 30-year loans have a higher interest rate because there's more risk. Shorter product has a lower interest rate. And so we said, okay, that makes sense. Let's offer this. And so we offer a 7 or a 10-year balloon, depending on the appetite of the borrower, and for that balloon risk, because it does have the balance is still there when that loan matures, but it drops the interest rate over 100 basis points. Our portfolio now is just under $500 million in 442 loans. We did the Wainwright deal, was $159 million. The smallest one we have is about a $25,000 homeowner association loan. So there's no real loan limits. It's all our lending is based on what's an acceptable risk to Alaska Housing. And I'll talk more about how we make that determination a little further in the presentation. If I can keep it going fast enough. There we go. And then we got about 57 homeowners association loans also. So that gives you an idea of who we are, why we're here, and how we might help. Any questions so far? Yes, Jim. Great question. He's asking about the qualifications of the sponsor to access those funds. We're looking at nonprofit entities or regional housing authorities to do that. And again, we're a creature of statute. We don't make up the rules. We're told how to do it, and that's the authority we've been given. Right now, the program's set up for home ownership. So if it's owner-occupied, yeah, technically, but typically we see it done for first-time home buyers, and the sponsors we have now are using that program for down payment assistance, because everyone knows that's the biggest hurdle to home ownership. It's coming up with that down payment, and so they're using it for down payment assistance, and then the borrower qualifies for an 80% loan-to-value conventional loan. Hey, no mortgage insurance at 80%. Therefore, that's a piece of cash flow that can go towards paying, the low interest second, which is what it turns out to be. That's primarily how it's being used today. So let's talk about what is multifamily. Great segue, Jim, thanks. It's 5 or more independent living units. And independent living units gets kind of squishy when we get into where we are. What we typically see, and for the loan purchase program, that means that you have a bathroom and a kitchen, basically. And so, and they can be efficiencies all the way up to however many bedrooms the market will bear. And there's a threshold there, because once you start building 4 or 5 bedroom apartments, the rent is so much higher that people can afford to buy their home. And so people, typically larger families that have the income, don't rent larger apartments like that with all the bedrooms when they can afford home ownership. And so what we typically see is 1 to 3 bedroom apartments being developed with our programs. But the box or what's being financed needs to be 5 or more rental units. Detached, attached, separate parcels. When you think about it, everybody kind of thinks an apartment building is a big box with all the apartments in it. But maybe there's a duplex on this side of town, and it's owned by the same group that owns a triplex over here, and they're not too far apart, you know, same recording district, please. So that's 5 units. 3 and 2 is 5, and he could combine them together and use our program for that. And I bring that distinction out because the financing is different for 1 to 4 family than it is for 5 and up, and the qualifications and the down payment requirements change. So it's a personal economic decision the individual owner has to make on what he wants to do. Some might argue that lumping them together reduces liquidity because I can't release 2 of them because then there's only 3 left and I need 5 or more. And so it's more of the personal financial decision they get to make. I just want you to let them know the option. Where this comes into play more is in rural, where you're out and there's houses that are built or duplexes that are built, and then they can be combined into one project. So this is sort of a disclosure point. We talked about some of the incentives that come in, and so when you combine program resources, in other words, you're using your layered financing. You have our program. Maybe you have some tax credits in there. Maybe you have some home money in there, or other funding. It's important to be aware as the operator of these, because remember, what do I want to be is repaid, right? And so we don't like the defaults, so we talk about disclosure. It's important to remember that the most restrictive rule that comes with your funding is going to cloud the whole property. So while my multifamily loan purchase program requires compliance with state law and compliance with landlord-tenant law, that's about it. The other sources of funding may restrict it differently. And we don't get into governing that. We only monitor the money that we're loaning out. But just to be aware, that because we've run into it before. They go, well, you didn't require that. Yeah, but you signed the document with the other person that gave you $1 million. And so you got to follow their rules too. That's a heads up on that. This is the biggie, and this sort of ties into my reoccurring theme. The cash flow after the operating expenses must support the debt service. And that's really the fundamental difference between multifamily financing and 1 to 4 family financing. Single family, duplex, triplex, fourplex is on the first one, the 1 to 4 family, you're using the strength of the borrower to qualify for the loan. It's just like when you got your house loan, you had to qualify for it. That's how the financing is priced for risk. On multifamily, I'm looking at the collateral. I'm looking at the cash flow coming out of the rental that can cover operating expenses and then support the debt service. And what Alaska Housing does is we finance these products based on the market they're in. And so we're not looking at super A property manager versus super Z property manager and doing different loan amounts. we're looking at how that property should operate in that market based on the comparable properties chosen by the appraiser. Okay? So that's sort of the main distinction, is we're using the income approach to underwrite our stuff for multifamily, and the 1 to 4 families looking at the financial strength of the individual borrower to qualify them for the loan. We don't do construction loans. That's typically the business of the banks and mortgage companies. What we do is the takeout financing or the term financing. And the way we support our lending partners is that we offer forward commitments. And so what that means is we get a loan package into us, and then we'll commit to finance that loan. We'll commit all terms, conditions, interest rate, and provide stable fiscal certainty on the takeout piece. And then that's supposed to give a construction lender more comfort, because they know then they have an exit strategy, because they can sell the loan. If it's built the way it was supposed to be built, they can sell the loan to Alaska Housing. We always honor our commitments. It's one of the things I tell everybody. That's bad business not to do that, and we're not here for bad business. So we issue the forward commitment under the loan purchase program, which again, we're the investor in the secondary market. That's a 12-month commitment. When I do a direct loan, like for targeting special needs or affordable housing, I can go out 24 months, and that can be extended. So that's 2 years, lock rate, lock terms. And so basically the idea there is 2 construction seasons in case something happens, which it does. And so that's just something to be heads up. We don't do the construction loan, so when you come to us or you go to your lender, you're going to work with them on the construction loan, but then we would be the takeout piece. We do 85% loan to value, or 80% loan to value on the lender loans. That means I need 20% of borrower equity into the transaction. And we'll talk a little bit about later how that's calculated, because it's different for a purchase transaction versus a refinance. I don't need someone to put 20% down if they're refinancing and they already have the equity, right? That's just common sense. So, but when you're acquiring it, we need to see the 20% coming into the transaction from the applicant. We do, as I said before, 30-year rates, 30-year fixed, 15-year fixed, which is not very popular, and we'll circle all the way back around. Why? Why wouldn't 15-year be as popular? Because it's a shorter amortization, right? So you have a higher payment. And what's that mean for the investor in an apartment building when they have a higher mortgage payment? Sure, they pay off the mortgage for the apartments in 15 years, but it means less cash flow coming out of that building into their pocket. And so typically what we see is they take advantage of the 30-year fixed, or they use the balloon feature, which is amortized over 30 years. So you have the same P&I, but we have that call feature. And again, the call feature means it's a shorter loan, so it's a lower interest rate. Our loans are assumable. And what that means is that we expect that to be actually rather popular in the next couple years if interest rates ever start to climb again. And so what that means is they're qualifying assumable loans. And so that, as an investor in one of our loans, which is what you're doing because you're putting your money in and then making payments, is that's a value to you, because the individual that you're going to sell that apartment building to doesn't have to get their own financing. They can assume your loan if they have the difference between the purchase price and the balance being assumed. And they're assumed on the same term and rates and conditions and anything. So if I'm locked into us, or if we have a 6.5% loan and rates go up to 10%, there's value to that 6.5% loan. Okay, so we do offer assumable loans. And again, with the multifamily, I don't have an owner occupancy or a state residency requirement. These are designed to be investor loans. I don't have any. Again, I'm looking at the building. I want to know the building's going to operate. It's good condition. It's going to generate the revenue to pay the operating expenses and the debt service with the predictable rate of return for the investor or the owner. I said I'd dive into this one a little further. This is the 15-year fixed rate financing for improvements to the common areas of homeowners associations. So that's, you get out the decks and you see what a unit's called, right? The declarations describe the unit, and then you know what's the owner's and what's the association's responsibility. We can finance repairs to what's the responsibility of the association. It's a term loan. Again, we don't do construction loans, but we do forward commit up to a year, which allows the association to shop around. And again, generally these are smaller loans for repairs, right? So roof leaks, or somebody comes in and they poke their pencil right through the sill plate because it's all dry rotted out. And so that's what this is designed to do while maintaining the affordability aspect that comes with condominium ownership. Forward commit 12 months. The Homeowners Association doesn't have to be on our accepted list. So you know how for conventional financing or government financing, you'd have to be approved, right? But for the Homeowners Association loan, that wouldn't make sense for us to do that because maybe they need the repairs done or reserves boosted to get on the list. And so the idea is to afford them an opportunity or access to capital, frankly, to improve their buildings to make them financeable. Everything's on our website, which is AHFC.us. And when you go under the Homeowners Association Loan Program, all the forms are there. We put them out there like that. First of all, stable, predictable, right? I told you I'm not changing these programs because then people don't remember how to use them. And so the second piece, though, is the first thing condo owners want to know is, what do you mean we're going to borrow money? And so, well, here's the forms, here's what it means, and so it's a form of disclosure, again, to help facilitate the program. And you apply directly to us. And we turn these apps in about a month, 30 days it takes us right now. Everything's sort of slowed down a little bit, as all agencies with dealing with what we're dealing with. And so we can get the commitment out in about 30 days. Any questions on the Homeowners Association Loan Program? I think it's an underutilized good asset, and some people do it. Oh, I know what else there is with it. We do require 75% of the unit owners to approve of the association borrowing. Okay, so it's a supermajority vote, and that can be counter to a lot of the decks, right? That say, oh well, the board can do whatever they want with 50% plus one, or some of them are 30%. We want the 75% because it shows the unit owners have approved their association going into debt. And so how's this loan repaid? Well, I told you that we don't make them put special assessments on the units because then you got too much on a title and people can't sell their project or their unit. So what they typically do is we take the amortized portion of the debt and raise the dues. And the dues goes up $20 to $50, and that's how it's done. Anything else? Homeowners, yes. Jeff. Up here, we've been doing a lot of weatherization work. Furnaces, a dozen, I would guess, but I'm guessing. We do furnaces, insulation in the roof, things like that. In Southeast, we do a lot of water damage stuff, leaking roofs, rotten sill plates, and Anchorage is a mix. It's usually, Anchorage is built so fast, they put those contractor decks on a lot of the condo projects and they rot. And so we've done a lot of deck repair of all things because it's a common area, right? It's not the unit owner's responsibility in Anchorage. That's what I see with it. I also said I'd dive into this one a little bit because this one's fairly well utilized, but it's everybody have heard the term silver tsunami. You know what that means? It's sort of a tongue-in-cheek discussion on the demographics of the elderly population that's growing in Alaska. It's exponential. We're getting more elderly folks up here than anywhere in the nation. And so where are they going to live? Well, they're going to live where they're going to live because we're all Alaskans, right? We're all independent and brave and strong, and then something happens. And you either transition into healthcare and then come out of it, or you just have an aging progression where you need some assistance with maybe your meals, or maybe helping change your clothes, or writing correspondence to family members, things like that. The activities of daily life, it's called. And so what the assisted living industry does is try to fill that niche in between independent living, which is all of us independent Alaskans, and nursing care, which is wicked expensive. All right, so assisted living is sort of in between, and there's some astronomical numbers, quite frankly, associated with it, but nothing compared to nursing care. And so it's a way of providing housing for folks that need just a little help with their activities of daily life, and the state licenses these facilities. And so we provide the financing to support, again, this home care alliance, so we don't have 150 room hospital wings. I mean, that's like a nursing home, and that's not what folks typically want to go to unless you can get into the Pioneer home. That's an assisted living home. So we offer up to 100% financing for small assisted living homes. We do it on the value of the real estate, and this is important because it's a business loan, all right? If you go to the bank and say, I want to buy this house and I'm going to run assisted living, they say you can't have owner-occupied standard financing because that's not for business purposes. That's for where people live. So it sort of knocks you out of that whole financing tool for single family. We're just doing the value of the real estate. So we get the house appraised at whatever it appraises at, but the business interest is separate. So if someone's doing a home loan where they want to acquire an occupied or an up and running licensed home, we don't finance the business piece of that. That's between the parties. Okay, so it's an important concept. We're only financing real estate. There's my new business value. We do say limited to 1 to 4, and with modest improvements. Fourplexes are tricky because it depends on the population that's being served. But single families are popular and duplexes are popular. And typically with a duplex, what they do is the care provider lives in one unit and the resident lives in the other, meaning the individual that needs the services, and then they cut a doorway in between. And that way the care provider can get back and forth. And the state licenses this home, and so if they license it, we can finance it. No MI, so again, 100% financing with no MI. We do require an annual certification of the number of residents. Basically, it's a copy of the license, so we can show that we've used state money for its intended purpose, i.e. for financing assisted living homes. Yes. Assisted living is licensed by the state in 2 groups. One is elderly, and the other is developmentally disabled, and then there's a foster care, 3 groups. There's a foster care wing. So transitional housing is what you're talking about, where someone's coming out of corrections maybe and needs a little help to go through. That's back to my multifamily loan program. It's the direct lending program. We do finance those homes. It comes down to, if I'll get a little bit to answer your question, it comes down to how you're going to pay for everything. Because typically those populations don't have a lot of income to support rent, and so we're looking at how the utility bills get paid, right? How the maintenance gets done on the home, and then size the debt that it can carry after those expenses. That's the challenge with that one is there's not a lot of income coming in the front, and there's not a lot of development subsidies available to lower the requirement of takeout debt. I'll talk about that in just a slide or two. So as I said, these assisted living homes have to be licensed by the state of Alaska. You apply directly to Alaska Housing. One of the features I like about this program is that it's priced like a multifamily, so your interest rates are in the 6.5 range, and so everybody says, whoa, for a house that's a lot. Well, it's a house that is being operated as a business, and when you look at the cash flows coming out, it supports it quite readily. So we're not over-subsidizing that market. But if you decide, assisted living, I'll back up a little bit, assisted living it's intense. You're dealing with people 24/7. And so people burn out. And so again, what I like about this program is there's no call on the loan if someone decides to get out of the business. They just can maintain their payments. What we have to do is show that the home was licensed when it was open and financed, so that we can show that we did our purpose. And if they quit 2 years down the road, they can hang on to that 6.5% loan all day. As long as they make the payments, right? Come on, give me a head bob. All right, I said I'd get into this. This is a little bit into our goal program. These are the development grants that the state offers through Alaska Housing as well as the federal government. And the concept is it takes $1 to build something that's going to be worth 70 cents at best, okay? That's just the reality of the market. When you add in developers' fees and contractors' fees and soft costs and everything. And so what we try to do is cover that gap, or more of that gap, so the targeted population can afford to live there. And this ties into the transitional housing question, because if someone can't pay the $1,250 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment, the bills don't get paid. And so for new construction, by lowering the cost of construction with these development grants, then the takeout debt is smaller, and therefore the lower income coming into that cash flow waterfall that I got a slide coming up on is able to support that amount of debt. And so we have the low-income housing tax credit program, which I already talked about briefly, which is an allocation of tax credits. It's a credit against income tax liability, and typically what's done with those is they're syndicated. And so it's good for 10 years. You get an amount of credit based on your cost of construction, and the application process for 10 years, okay? And so what an investor does, they'll come in, they're big investors from outside, and they buy these credits and then resell them on the market. And what that does is you as the developer are coming in, qualifying for these credits, and then you're selling them. And so when you sell them, they're paying you cash today, okay? So you're getting, well, it's over 2 years they do it, but you get cash up front for the 10-year compliance period, all right? And that is the development subsidy, because then that cash can go towards the sticks and bricks and mortar that it takes to put together the complex that you want to build. That's a real rough and dirty version of the low-income housing tax credit program. It's rather involved. If you want to get into doing tax credits, I recommend you develop a team and make sure you got a lawyer and a tax consultant or a CPA. Nadine's giving me the head bob. Thank you. The home program is another federal money that's allocated. It's allocated nationwide by the feds, but it's based on population. So we get about the same amount every year. Our money is good for everywhere but Anchorage. Anchorage has their own home allocation, and it's another form of subsidy for the development of affordable rental housing. And by affordable, they're targeting about 55% median income for the tenants to qualify to live there. And so it's in the 40s, I think, for a family of four. Does that sound right? Somewhere in there, just to give you a ballpark. And so that's the population that you're targeting with this. And so the home money, again, is a competitive allocation, and it's awarded to the successful applicant who then draws it down like a construction loan, but it's a grant, so there's no loan associated with it. And then it sits out there, a covenant's recorded against the property where the owner promises to keep it affordable and for 30 years, okay? So that's the strings. Remember I talked about the different sources of funding and the restrictive strings, the most restrictive? Well, if you're getting home money and you put a 30-year covenant against your property, you have to honor that covenant for the 30 years, meaning maintaining the number of units as affordable. The FHDF is the Senior Citizen Housing Development Fund. That's a capital appropriation. We used to fund it ourselves, and then the markets changed, and now the states supported it. Again, we don't have a capital budget, so this program is empty, so to speak, right now. We anticipate it coming online when a capital budget is approved. And it's designed for the development of elderly housing or senior housing. And it's the same concept. It's a form of cash subsidy that comes into the development side so the takeout debt can be smaller, and therefore the apartments are more affordable for the elderly occupants. What's unique about this one is there's no income restrictions on it. With the tax credits and the home money, you have to income qualify the residents. The qualifications for the Senior Citizen Housing Development Fund is that they meet the federal definition of elderly, which is 80% of the units are occupied by people 55 years and older, or 100% are occupied by 62 and older individuals. So it's an age thing. The government allows us to discriminate for a couple times, and age is one of them, and this is a program that's designed to do that. Again, we're trying to provide housing opportunities for this wave of elderly Alaskans that are coming through demographically through the population. We also have a teacher, healthcare, and public safety professional program. This, again, was a creature of statute. It had a loan program with it that sunsetted, but I can still do multifamily because they didn't sunset the multifamily, and we still get grants. Mostly what we see this for is in rural areas for VPSO housing. And because what happens in rural, same with teachers, is someone goes out to a rural community and they've got this grandeur idea of they're going to be the Grizzly Adams of wherever they want to go, and they get out there and the reality sinks in, and then they turn around and leave. That's not good for the community. When you have leaders in the community, such as teachers and doctors and nurses, you want them to stay there and develop the relationships with the community, because that's what makes a strong, vibrant community. And so this, and part of the complaint when they leave is the housing. The housing stock is lousy. And so this program's designed, again, to fill that gap between what it's valued at based on the rents and what it costs to build it. So we can have quality, safe housing in rural areas targeting these populations: teachers, public health, teachers, and public safety. Again, that's a state-funded program through our capital budget. So that's another empty pot at this point that we we're not shutting down the programs, we're just waiting for the funding like everybody else. So these are grant programs. Remember, I'm the loan guy, so I want to be repaid. These are the grant programs, so they want compliance. Yes? Not under the definition given to us. Good question, thanks. So these are done by our planning department because they're grants, they're competitive allocations through a grant process, and that cycle's going on now. What I encourage you to do is contact planning, go to our website under planning, and there's a description of all these programs. The best tool that they have that I think is a listserv. If you don't mind one more email, you sign up for the listserv, and then all the notices will come to your email, and you can follow when the opening period is for applications, when the training's offered for these programs, and just sort of stay in tune with it, because again, even with some of the like this elderly housing stuff, you need a team to really pull it off, and you want to keep notes and keep a file for this. There's my list. So this is what goal kind of looks like. This is a 35-unit project that we did in Juneau. 4 or 5 years ago, there was a stronger cry than usual about housing needs in Juneau, and so we targeted the Juneau area, and this is how they put the deal together. It was a $10.5 million complex for 35 units. And so everybody knows that 35 units isn't worth $10.5 million bucks. And so again, this is why you need these layers of subsidy in here. And so the hard sticks and bricks was 7.8. The construction financing was another 352. The term loan financing was 136. That's our loan fee. That's the appraisal fee. That's the legal fees to close the loan and setting up reserves, because they have the same reserves like a single family, taxes, insurance, and replacement reserves. And I'll talk more about replacement reserves in a minute. Soft costs. Soft costs are the engineering, things like that behind it. Syndication costs, that's when they sell the credits. Remember I said they're syndicated? Nobody does anything for free, so even though they get a rate of return. So they're charging the syndication fees, and then the developer's got to get paid. They're the one taking the risk. And so we allow up to a 15% of the project amount for a developer fee. That's a competitive thing. So sometimes what they do is they defer some of that fee. So this is how the funding, the 10.5, was spent to build the 35 units in Juneau. This is where it came from. $8 million came from the tax credits, the sale of the tax credits. They got an energy credit because they put solar panels on it. Okay. And so that was, again, they could sell those energy credits on the secondary market, and that brought another $30,000 in. Rasmussen's been a great partner for affordable housing. They provided $350,000 for this project. I did a $2.1 million loan, which is 73% of the value. So there's a little back envelope math. You get an idea of where these things pencil based on the cash flow when you're looking at how much money it costs to build. Servicer coordinator donation, that was basically someone promised services and they had value to it, and so they counted that as a source. And then they didn't defer any of their developer fee on this. So that's one thing. If the servicer coordinator went away, maybe they'd defer some of that developer fee on the prior slide. And by deferred, what that does is it sets up as a loan that's repaid, soft loan through cash flow after operating expenses and hard lien first lien debt service. Okay, so it's not deferred forever, because it is attached to the property with a mortgage, deed of trust, and there is a payment schedule, but it's typically soft. So if it does not get paid because there's a bad year or higher vacancy, then the developer is not forced to foreclose on their own project. So that's kind of what goal is. Are there any questions on goal? Yes. It was a mix of 2s and 3s. So that's really up to the developer. When in the application period, we get a market study done, and the market study will show what the demand is for the units. So if there's a lot of couples without kids, then 2 bedrooms probably works, or even 1 bedrooms in a community. I'm talking demographically. But if it's more families, then you need maybe 3 bedrooms or even 4. And we've done as much as 4. But again, when you get to 4 and up, that threshold of what it costs to rent that unit versus what it costs to own your own home, it gets crossed, it gets close. So what the market study does is help identify the unit matrix. Yes?
What was the
The Rasmussen grant? The goal program allocated the tax credits. Yep, the developer put together the energy credits, applied and received the Rasmussen grant, and applied and got the loan from us and worked out the fee. That's, again, the developer's doing all the work up front, and then they get paid at the end of the day for taking the risk on that project. Correct. And that basically is 10 years, so it's $800,000 a year of credit, and it was probably a little more than that, because what you find is the price changes. So the syndicates maybe pay 95 cents on the dollar. Again, that compensates them for risk, so they say, right? 2 years ago, they were paying $1.05, because they also get depreciation, and they have a capital account on the thing. So the economics of it, and this is why you got to put together a team, because it quickly even goes beyond me, because I'm just the loan guy. You know, this is the project management and the tax credit syndication part, and so the CPAs can explain how those credits are best used. What happens is when we do the award, the allocation award based on our competitive award process, which is all online, and so you can read what the scoring is, you can do sample scoring and see what your number will be. We put the list of the awards out on the internet, on our webpage, and basically the developers start getting phone calls. Okay. This is basically what I wanted to talk about a lot today, is our loan purchase program. And remember, this is where, and I'm going to dive down into the program a little bit. So if anybody gets bored or I'm past their interest level, I don't mind if you leave. You don't hurt my feelings. I'm here to share information. So I appreciate everyone being here, but here we go into the weeds. So the multifamily loan purchase program, that's where we're the secondary market. This is where we're providing capital so partner banks can sell us these loans secured by the multifamily financing, and it's for market rate rental housing. So what's that mean, right? Market rate rental housing means you're going to rent the apartment for what the market will bear. Everybody knows pretty much what units are around town, and that's market rate. The affordable stuff that we do directly is below market rate, and so that's why there's more incentives in the development side, so there's not as much debt, and so you can charge lower rents. As a matter of fact, they're restricted rents. In other words, the properties have covenants recorded against them that require you to keep the rents at a certain level, okay? And so this is for market rate rental housing. This is the private sector. We provide up to 80% loan to value financing. And I said we talk about it. The refi, though, is up to 80%, but I can do all the debt, buy and rehab. And I got a slide coming up that talks about that. So a refinance, you can do 100% of the outstanding debt with one caveat: it's got to be seasoned debt. In other words, we're not going to do a loan if someone took out $150,000 6 months ago on their apartment building, and then they want to refinance it into ours. Well, I'm going to ask, what did you use the $150 for? And if you used it for a new roof or new siding, you went to vinyl siding because it's more efficient than wood siding or something like that, that's fine. That's a capital improvement to the project. I can do that. If you use it to buy a motorhome and go tour Napa Valley, I can't finance that unless it's seasoned debt. So if you did it 2 years ago, we don't ask. Okay? So that's how we get to that 100% of outstanding debt number, sort of a back approach to it. Do we know what a debt service coverage ratio is? Yeah, I see some heads. Good. It's really self-explanatory. It's the ratio between the net operating income, which is income minus expenses, roughly, and I got slides that will talk about that. Told you I'm going into the weeds. And then how that covers the debt. We need 25% more cash flow than the debt service, and the debt service is the P&I, okay? Because your taxes and insurance and reserves are all considered to be operating expenses in your pro forma, so P&I. So I need 25% more to purchase this loan from the participating lender. Most projects pencil comfortably with that. about 10 years ago, 5 and 6 plexes were having a little trouble, okay? Because that was when, remember when utility rates shot up and rents were flat for a little bit, and that squeezed that debt coverage ratio a bit, and so we had trouble penciling 5s and 6s. But anything now is pretty basic unless there's a fundamental problem with the property, okay? So if it doesn't have a 125, that's a flag. What's going on? Oh, well, the tenants have been there for 15 years and they're still only paying $600 a month. Okay, that's a reasonable reason. But remember, I'm underwriting based on the market. And so if the market says that unit can get $1,200 a month, that's the amount of debt I can finance on it, even though they're renting at $600. Now, is that a good business decision? I can't tell them if it's good or bad. That's their business decision to make. However, by showing them the math, we can help them operate these projects, maybe get a little better rate of return for the investor, meaning the owner. Long and short of all that is I need 25% more cash flow of net operating income over my debt service. And again, like I said, it's basic math. We do recourse loans, and we're back to disclosure again. So recourse means that I need individuals on my promissory note. You don't have to come into title. The very popular limited liability company under Alaska law is perfectly adequate for holding property, and it provides a corporate veil for operations. But I won't lend strictly to a limited liability company. I'm going to look at the members of the LLC, and anybody with a 10% membership interest or more, I'm going to say you're a co-borrower, please. And then it's the business decision of the individual whether they want to do that, because we're fully aware there's other investors out there, Fannie and Freddie, that do, or FHA, that do non-recourse. They're strictly relying on the property. When you think about it, Alaska housing is restricted to Alaska. My market for lending is like 750,000 people. Fannie and Freddie have the whole, and FHA have the whole United States. And so their market is much broader. And so we go recourse because it's a higher risk product, frankly. And so recourse note, disclosure. Replacement reserves, disclosure. This is because part of the cash flow that comes out of your monthly payment goes into a reserve account. It's a capital reserve account, and I'll talk about that in a minute on why that's there and what it does. And the reason I call it a disclosure item is because the owner looks at it, mostly mom and pops, and say, well, where's my money? Well, the bank has it. The servicing bank has it. Well, how do I get it? Well, you have to talk to them about it. And then they're mad. And so if you're up front as a loan officer and you say, hey, there's replacement reserves requirements, this is what you do. You'll be working with Jeff over in this department to get them. It really helps our friends on the servicing side because the origination piece takes 6 months tops. And these are 30-year loans. So help our friends on the servicing side. There's my prop for them. We do require a home inspection. We had a whole list of rules that were cumbersome and awkward, and then the state was nice enough to license home inspectors several years ago, and we got out of that who's better than who. And so if you have a home inspection license, your license for home inspections, that's what we require, that individual to go in and look at the property. And what are they looking for? Well, health and safety items predominantly. Remember, I'm a mission-driven corporation. I'm trying to do safe, quality, affordable housing, or safe quality housing under this program. Affordability is subjective to the relationship between the tenant and the owner. And so we require the home inspection. The heads up there is if the inspector identifies something, we're going to say, well, what needs to be fixed is a condition of the financing. Okay? Now let's be reasonable. If there's a chip in the enamel in the bathroom sink that's not rusted through, I don't care about that. But mostly what we see are smoke detectors aren't working, CO detectors aren't working, smoke seals aren't installed, fire extinguishers aren't in kitchens, basic rental tenant amenities that should be there for the safe environment. Sometimes it's the gaps between where the plumbing comes out of your boiler and goes out to the rest, they're not sealed, right? It's a fire code thing. And so the inspectors are going to come up with a report. We don't care who is used. We let you use who you want as long as they're licensed by the state, and we don't say who orders it. We stay out of that part of the transaction. Remember, these are market rate buy-sell transactions predominantly, and we don't want to get in that business. We just want to make sure that we're lending money that's an acceptable risk to Alaska Housing Finance. So we do require the home inspection, and these are originated by the lender of your choice. Now, we do have approved lenders because I look at them, make sure they understand what multifamily is and how it's different from single family. Single family is wicked regulated now with federal oversight and everything, and it's a tough business. But it is different than the multifamily because, again, we're underwriting the income capacity or net income capacity of that product, the collateral, as opposed to the capacity of the individual that's going to live in the property. Some more disclosure on new construction. Everybody know what our Bs and our construction inspections are about. Our forms are the PUR 101 and 102. Multifamily is residential housing, so under the statute, we're required to do these for multifamily. Again, I stay out of it. I want the form signed by the inspector with a valid number, and I'm happy. So that's, again, we're kind of falling back on the developer of the project on new construction, and that's the responsibility they take to have these inspections done and to make sure it meets the minimum energy rating. The contractor has to have a residential endorsement. Again, that's a statutory holdover from our 1 to 4 family because multifamily is residential. And so that's the responsibility of the lender. We look at it, but we're not, it's when it comes in, we can look it up online. It's right there. And so we do require the residential endorsement because we are building residential housing. We talked about the 1.25 deck coverage as an option on that because when a project comes online, maybe it's empty and it's going to lease up in 3 months, okay? But the construction lenders wants to get paid off. And so we can establish what's called a rent-up reserve, and that's basically a sinking fund that's designed to cover the operating expenses while the units lease up. Because if you only have 1 of 10 units occupied, your income's way down. But your electric bill doesn't change, your fuel oil bill doesn't change, your garbage collection bill doesn't change. And so a rent-up reserve it's identified by the appraiser. The dollar amount is identified by the appraiser, and it covers that period between completion, when you get a CO or the fire marshal says you can open it, and when you get what's called sustained occupancy is when the occupancy and the rents generated support the operations and debt service. And so that's a time period based on the market. If nobody's renting 2-bedroom apartments, it's going to be a long one for 2-bedroom apartments. Fortunately, it's a little different and has been for the last decade, and so it can be rather aggressive. 3 months rent-up is reasonable. But again, we rely on the professional third party, the appraiser, to make that determination. And that's an option to avoid the rent-up. Yes, Nadine? No. Short answer is no under this program, unless you come to us and want to do 150 units. And then we're going to say 150 in Fox? Where's the support for that many units all at once? And so what we would do is say, well, that might not fit, but you could phase it and do 20 units a year or 25, depends. And then the individual's going, well, wait a minute, I'm the developer. I have all this capital at risk. I don't want to risk that capital without some evidence. And so then they kind of get their own market study and share it with the lending bank. So markets are unique. It depends. Anchorage is different from Fairbanks, is different from Juneau, is different from Bethel. It's all, and that's, we sort of look at we go back to our goal program. Remember I said our planning department gets market studies for the allocation of tax credits. And so we do have market studies that are paid for by the applicants. They're not generally public, but internally we can look at it and you have a feel kind of what a market can carry. Fairbanks, I think, easily could take 100 units. But all at once in one part of town, that's kind of the market. The demographic will be there. In other words, there will be people in the community that are eligible to rent that apartment, but will they want to? And that's the difference between the demographic and the market, and that's what the market study tries to drill down to, and is part of the personal business decision that's made by the developer. The appraiser has to go back out and say, yeah, it was built the way that we said it was going to be built because we're relying on that appraisal that was done on specs and plans. And so they do a final. That trips up construction lenders because construction lenders know it's built. They have a value. Their job's done. but we need it to do the takeout. And so that's often a missed thing, and they're $500 or something like that. But then if it's not in the budget, it's $500, and everybody's freaked out by the end of the construction loan anyway because there's so much money that went out and nothing's come back yet. So that's just sort of a heads up that we do require the final certification of value by the appraiser. If it's well and septic, DEC has to approve it. It's residential, commercial. There's a process for that, or an engineer can do it. We stay out of that as long as we get the paper that shows that it's we got the well flow and the right size septic for the number of bedrooms. And a cost certification. The one thing that Alaska Housing is prohibited by statute is giving equity extraction loans. So I can't give money back that's just pure cash based on sweat equity, essentially. And so we meet that statutory requirement by getting a cost certification. And as I said, it's really a no-brainer with any new construction. It's $1 to build it, and it's worth 70 cents or less. So I know the costs are in there, but we document our file with the cost certification. Oftentimes on the private deals, we use the construction loan draws. And that's really enough to show that what they've got into it as the owner exceeds the loan amount. When you get into the credit deals and the affordable housing, CPA does it, and it costs money, but then you have the document that's used for what's called a subsidy layer review. In other words, at the end of the day, our planning department makes sure that projects aren't over-subsidized, and they use that cost certification to do it. So rural. We have our own definition of rural. Again, that's in regulation, I believe. So what it means is the first $250,000 is priced a whole percent or 100 basis points below our published rates. So if I'm offering a 6.5% 30-year fixed and you're in rural, then the first $250,000 finance is at 5.5%. Okay? And the definition, 6,500 less when you're not on the road system, 1,600 or less on the road system, and then there's these carve-outs. There's this big circle around Anchorage, and there's a big circle around Fairbanks. And that's how they defined what is rural and what is not. And so when you go over $250,000, then we blend the rates. And that's literally math again. You're looking at what the interest rate is at the 100 basis points lower on the first 250, and then what the interest rate is on the rest, and you come up with a blended rate, and we round up to the nearest 8. So it's an incentive for development in rural. Participation loans are the workaround to our bar on equity extraction. There's one note and one deed of trust, but it's a shared lien position. So that's the form for our note that covers this. And so what it does is allow a bank or a mortgage company, maybe they have a relationship with a customer, and they want to help him out with that trip down Napa Valley, right? And he's got equity in his multifamily, but they really don't have the appetite for that big a loan for a 40-unit multifamily complex. And so they can originate the loan, share the lien position with us, and then sell us the loan at whatever percent. Remember I said we started at 80% participation and went to 100? Well, we still kept the participation amount because it allows the lenders to participate in that first lien position loan. It's a first deed of trust. And then we don't care what they use the proceeds of their loan for. So again, it can fund whatever their customer relationship is. Typically we see the loan come to us with a 30-year fixed, and the lenders is maybe 10. Okay, and then it's a combined amortization. When the lender loan pays off, the P&I stays the same. And so what that does for everybody that's quick with their calculators in their head means that my loan pays off a lot faster because it's basically, the payment's the same. Alaska Housing, after the lender participation is paid off, gets more principal because the payment's the same. And that's our incentive for doing it because, again, why are we making loans? Because we've determined they're an acceptable risk, and so we can get repaid. Because when we get repaid, then we have funding to lend out. We don't always have to go to the bond market and be subject to bond rates. The request for commitment is the offer. It's a contract piece, right? Offer, acceptance, consideration. And so that's what starts the contract between the lender and Alaska Housing. Again, the participation is a shared lien. and that's how that goes. So contracts. Everybody remember business law 101, right? Offer, acceptance, consideration. And that's what we're doing. We're offering contracts for financing. And we're doing it that way because they're contracts. The state honors their contracts. So does Alaska Housing. It provides fiscal certainty to the transaction. That's what we're trying to do, is provide stability in the financial world so these housing units get developed, because they don't otherwise. And then you don't have enough, and then rents are too high, and then people are sleeping in their cars again. So it's really sort of a balance. It's why Alaska Housing was created in 1972, was to bring affordable capital to Alaska and to avoid that boom-bust cycle of financing where other investors would just back out and say, oh, oil patch, we're not lending there. That wipes out our whole state for conventional financing. And so Alaska Housing was created to smooth that out by offering products like this. Any questions so far? Everybody, because I'm about to go into the weeds on how to get a file into us. I'm going to talk about the forms and documentation that we require when we get a file. I'm going to talk a little bit about the property, what we look for in a property, the characteristics and the reports we require, and the property management and what we expect in property management. Briefly on that, anybody can manage their own property. That's the law. We're not second guessing that. But if you bring us a buyer who lives in California and he wants to buy a multiplex in Fairbanks, we're going to require local property management, so there's someone to be local to take care of the tenant's needs. Okay, that's the basic on the property management. That's why we say you got to address it. And then replacement reserves. So the loan summary is the abstract that we require, and that is basically covers all these categories. It's prepared by the seller, which is the lender who's selling us the loan. Defines who the borrowing entity is, right? Well, Lending 101, who's the borrower? And the purpose of the loan. Is it a purchase? Is it a refinance? Is it new construction? The proposal overview talks about the loan itself and what the proposal is. We get information on the borrower, the organization. If you can get online and start a limited liability company in about 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes, if you got a credit card, and boom, you're a legal entity in the state of Alaska, a separate legal entity. Well, that doesn't talk about what happens, for instance, when there's a divorce between the members of that limited liability company. And I don't mean a literal divorce, I mean just a partnership split, right? And so that's called an operating, I'm sorry, go ahead.
AHFC, the bond market that you guys depend on, like Wall Street.
Correct.
Okay.
We have, our board authorized at the last meeting a $160 million issuance. And so we're shopping right now. We use financial advisors that are on contract. There's a request for proposal process. And so they're the big Wall Street firms, and they advise us when the pricing is right to get the best deal for us. And so and the general obligation on Alaska Housing, excuse me, so we're using our balance sheet essentially to back up our promise to repay these bonds. We have net assets of $1.5 billion right now. 160 is all we need. I mean, it doesn't make sense to go out and sell a bunch of bonds, because you got to start payments right away to bondholders if we don't have the loans coming in that we want to purchase with that money. And so it's a balance between our demand for cash to buy the loans from our lending partners versus paying the bondholders what we agree to pay them in the bond agreement.
You know, recently the housing bubble, that's when it comes in and started to take over all this. And so they can protect you guys have to use that too.
A balance sheet. So conservative underwriting. So we're not doing part of the housing bubble. This is a good question. Part of the housing bubble problem was, everybody heard of liar loans, where you can just pretend you make this much, and they were making loans. They were giving people mortgages based on their oral representation on what they made without any backup. We never did those. We never did adjustable rate loans. We learned in the 80s that graduated payment loans don't really work. If anybody's been around that long, I have, in the ABE loans, they called them, which was a increased principal, and that was right as the oil tanked, and oh, that was ugly. And so we stuck with conventional loan products, and so we're basically doing standardized underwriting that hasn't changed, and it's conservative, and it shows in our balance sheet. And then we balance the bond obligation against our need for cash to buy these loans to provide the capital. And so, and these disclosures are all on our webpage. You can go on the front page under partners, and you drop down to professionals, and then there's all our investment data. We do quarterly financials on the corporation. You can get the bond to loan ratio. You can get how much we're making every quarter. And then we also pay a dividend to the state of Alaska every year out of 75% of our operating income. Drilling back down to borrower information. Organization is who they are. You can create a limited liability company, but we want the operating agreement that spells out who's in charge and how they handle conflict within that organization. We look at financial information. Hopefully we can get Schedule E's on the property from the seller. We're looking at the tax returns of the buyer just to see, like any normal lender would do. And we look at creditworthiness. Creditworthiness, I don't have a credit score, but if you haven't made a mortgage payment on, last year on your own home, why would it be an acceptable risk for me to give you a $1 million multifamily loan? So you got to have clean credit. We look at the project characteristics, and we do the analysis on why it's a good credit, and then we look to the lender to tell us it's a good deal. We want to support our lending partners, and so we work with them, and we hope that they'll work with us in giving us a recommendation. So the property, we use an appraisal. The licensed appraiser, licensed by the state of Alaska, has to have experience in multifamily, and we have a form called a UND 10, which again, this is sort of for the lender, and it addresses cosmetic items in the property that aren't necessarily of value. And then my favorite example is carpet. So again, you have that long-term tenant, and the carpet's nasty, but they don't want to bother the tenant, and the tenant's happy with it and pays their rent on time. Okay, we know that as soon as that tenant leaves, the owner's going to have to replace that carpet. Well, this UND 10 form identifies what some of those units might be based on the number of units that the appraiser goes in. Catches peeling paint, things like that. Yes, Jim? That's my $1.70 example. That's right. Always, everywhere. It's worse in rural and even in Anchorage for different reasons, interestingly enough. Anchorage's price differential between cost and value comes down to what the city does, and their permitting and planning and fees and all that. There's a large soft cost related there. Up here, a lot of it's transportation, getting literally the sticks and bricks to the community so they're available to be built. Please. It's different based on every community. Yeah, the short answer is there is willingness. Anchorage is not so much. Fairbanks is pretty good. They have the ability. We did projects over here on Airport Way, and where they had to tear down the old Fairview Manor, the city was able to waive the dump fees, and that was hundreds of thousands of dollars that added value to that project. And that was an example of the community or the city working with the developer to support the project. Yes, Jeff. her role in particular, I just soon not delve into that other than say the municipality has what's called a heritage land bank. So they have land and they want to develop it, but they run into challenges in how much they think it's worth, frankly. And so what they've done now is, you're exactly correct, they've partnered with Cook Inlet. They've used some of our funding to do it. What Cook Inlet's doing, Cook Inlet Housing Authority this is, which is a regional housing authority of Siri, right? And so what they're doing is leveraging the tax credits I talked about and some of the home money. They get NAHASDA money, which is the Native American Housing Assistance. So anyway, it's a federal allocation that comes up here. It used to be called Mutual Help. And so, and they're layering those funding sources to cover that gap that you're talking about, or we're talking about, between what it costs to do the business and what it appraises for and how much debt it'll carry. And so Cook Inlet's been very aggressive in Anchorage with that. They did 5 projects in Mountain View, separate projects, which was literally tearing down stuff built in the 40s and building new stuff. They've done some multifamily apartments. They have 3 or 4 going right now. But it takes layers of construction and creative financing, like selling the solar tax credits, which is only a couple years old. You know, that just became an option in the last 4 or 5 years. So yeah, we see them, but the Muni hasn't done a lot, in my opinion, and I'll probably get in trouble for that. The UND-9 is a form the lender uses on the home inspection because it tells the inspector how many units we expect to be looked at. We like to see 50% of the occupied units and 100% of the vacant units looked at. What we found, we had a lower standard earlier, and we found that some of the more creative agents in town were basically using a model unit for the inspection unit. And then the owner would get in there, and 6 months later they couldn't make the payment because the other units needed $50,000 of repair. And so at the UND-9, helps the inspector understand what our expectations are from the inspection report. Environmental reports are literally what that is. Phase 1's the most common terminology. I don't need a phase 1 until the loan is over $1.5 million. Basically, a phase 1 is a public records research, as well as a physical walking of the property and a viewing of aerial photographs, and you get a whole report. Under that, we get the online data reports, which is basically data mining DEC's website for any known problems. And the closer you are to the bases or the forts, the thicker those reports get. But typically, everything's on public water and sewer, and so there's ways to work with it. The only thing that we would hiccup on is if there's actual contamination on the actual property. So somebody didn't do their yank tank right or something like that, and DEC has a record of it. That's the property reports, and this is how we make a determination that that property is going to generate X dollars of income in the market in which it sits. The pro forma operating statement, that's what I was talking about, income, expenses, okay? We look at the appraisal to use comparable properties, apples to apples, so we typically look at comparables for geographic areas, and there's an exception to that, and that is when a geographic area is not keeping up with today's technology. So when an appraisal is engaged for, it's now called a scope of work. And the banks are very regulated, and lending companies are very regulated on how they engage for appraisers and who they can use. Okay? Alaska Housing's not. And so what we do, when I do a direct loan for a tax credit project, for instance, is we write our own scope of work. We write what we expect the appraiser to look at when they're providing us with an estimate of value for the property. Okay, and that allows them to consider things that perhaps are not considered by a private lender, such as high energy efficiency or more recent owner builders that haven't come into the database that appraisers use for comparable properties. In other words, they've never been sold. You see this in Nome a lot. There's a lot of owner builder single families, and these people spent hundreds of thousands of dollars building their house, and then they can't sell it because no one's ever sold one that churned it into the market. So there's no market comp reflecting the style and design of that house. And the same thing's happening in multifamily. So we look for reasonable adjustments, just like any prudent underwriting with an appraiser. You can't do $50,000 adjustments because one has a better view than the other. It just doesn't make economic sense because a view doesn't generally result in higher rents enough to cover that dollar amount. Remember, I'm trying to get paid, and I'm trying to make sure that the units will be rented by the people that live in that area. The appraisal is different from 1 to 4 family because it uses the income approach, the market approach, and the cost approach, and then reconciles those values. The 1 to 4 family only uses the market approach. That's the ready, willing, and able buyer and seller. So that sale contract drives the price. The multifamily appraisal looks at how much income the property can generate, what the expenses are. That's the income approach to get a net operating income. And then cost is new construction. With some of the older stuff, they throw out the cost approach because the depreciation number is kind of a wag, I guess. So it's the 3 different approaches to value, and therefore they're more expensive. So if you're used to spending $750 or $850 on a single family appraisal, multifamily can be $35,000 to $5,000. And then the capitalization rate, and this is the ratio between the net operating income and value. And this is derived from the market based on sales. It comes from the market approach, and it's used to help an appraiser determine the market value based on the income. Okay? We look at the property condition. I mentioned all health and safety items must be completed before closing. That's to protect the owner. And that comes down to the purchase and sale contract negotiations. You just say it's a condition of financing, so applicant, you got to work it out with your seller. If the appraiser has a value condition saying it's worth $1 million subject to the driveway being paved, we're going to say the driveway has to be paved. Because remember, I have hard statutes that authorize my lending. And one of them is that 80% loan to value. And if they're borrowing 80% based on a value, and it requires a driveway to have that value, then I have to require that that be a condition of financing. The UND 10s, cosmetic, peeling paint, things like that. Peeling paint, we usually say just paint it, encapsulate your paint. Escrow accounts and initial reserve deposits. This is really into the weeds, but if a health and safety report comes out and it's not spongy walls behind the showers or open electric panels or something like that, maybe something like a deck looks a little soft and will have to be replaced in a couple of years, we can escrow for that. Or let's say it's December and boy, there's peeling paint. You can't paint in December, you got to wait till June, right? And so what they do is they put aside money, the lender will put aside money, and when it warms up, that money's available to have the painting done. And that's all done under what's called a completion escrow agreement. And so that's an option to be used to address the property condition report that aren't health and safety. Okay? And what I ask there, if there's questions, we're happy to look at one and tell you what we're going to say on it. We're pretty consistent. The MFL ND5 is another little form we have that reminds an owner that he has to follow landlord-tenant law and the laws of the state of Alaska in operating his home, i.e. no discrimination. So here's a back-of-envelope way to size a loan, right? You know your NOI, because the seller gives you Schedule E's, okay? So you know you put depreciation back in because that's not a cash expense. And so you get an idea of what this property will generate. You look at the capitalization rates for your area. New constructions anywhere from 7.5% to 8.5%. Older stuff can be as high as 11. Single-use properties might be 12, okay? And it's the ratio between those. Rule of thumb, an old appraiser told me, was cap rates never below the interest rate. So that's something just to watch out for. Outside, you're going to see 4% and 5% cap rates. Outside meaning lower 48. Alaska's never experienced that. We've always been 7.5%, 8.5%. And that's a function of the market dynamics up here in the rents. And that gives you an estimate of the value. Okay, remember the ratio? It's just a straight ratio. And so you take your net income divided by the cap rate, which is 1%. And that gives you an idea of what it might be worth. Again, this is back of envelope. And we lend up to 80% of that. So you can roughly size about what we'll lend on doing it that way. And then the principal and interest of that debt has to be covered by the 125 debt coverage. Okay? Or you can take the net income, again, your NOI from the top, your Schedule E's, and divide it by that 1.25 ratio. And that's the maximum annual debt service that property will support. And then you can back into what the loan amount, or what the loan amount will be based on the size of the payment that it can support. That's just two quick ways when someone comes in and has an idea, because I don't know about all you, but that's what I get, is people come to me with an idea and I got to explain how their idea may or may not fit in our authorized box of tools. And so this is one way you can get close quicker. And when they don't cash flow, again, there's either something fundamentally wrong with it, i.e. the rents are way low, or there's some other market problem. So you have to put more down to get there, right? Smaller loan amount. Or you can buy down our interest rates. It's a little expensive, but it recaptures in about 8 years. If you're going to hold it longer than 8 years, you recapture it in the lower payment. Okay? And we allow the interest rates to be bought down up to 1%. 8 up to 1%, no more than 1%. And that's cash at closing. So this is how you figure out the maximum total principal. Remember, 80% is my hard statutory cap. I can't go over 80% of appraised value. So that's 80% of the acquisition price without rehab, or 80% plus allowable rehab costs. Allowable meaning basically what's identified in the health and safety inspection that the buyer has to pay for. If you refi existing debt and add rehab costs, that works. And I told you I need seasoned secondary debt. It has to be over 12 months. And I got a slide coming up that goes through the math, and this will make more sense. I got to get rid of those sounds in my presentation, don't I? I got a 100% construction cost, but that's a misnomer because we've already talked about construction costs are so much higher than what it'll appraise for. So we can do up to the 80%. Remember, it's the lesser of 80%. So that 80% of hard costs, no cash back. So in no case can we go over that 80% of appraised value, and we don't allow subordinate financing under this program. All right, so that's the 20% down. That's cash to the deal to get to that 80%. And this is the loan purchase program where the lender's selling us the loan. So this is the numbers behind it. Let's say I have a $500,000 appraised value. Maximum loan amount to 80% is $400,000, right? Basic math. So let's say the purchase price is $450,000. Okay, it's the lesser of appraised or purchase price to start your math. So now the maximum loan amount is $360,000. Okay, but I can go statutorily up to $4,000, and therefore there's $40,000 of potential rehab that can be financed with the product because I'm underwriting the appraisal on an as-repaired value in that market. And so if someone's buying something that needs to be fixed up and they're getting a super deal on it, they have the ability under our purchase program to finance those repairs to get it to the value where it should be. And I can't give cash back. Again, I'm repeating statute. Now, if the borrower put money in the last 12 months and can show me invoices that bought whatever he bought to fix it, remodeled kitchens, counters, cabinets, toilets, fixtures, yeah, we can refinance that because that's a capital cost that went into the property. But we can't send them down the Napa Valley yeehaw ride. We have a loan application which is called the UND-6. It's got to be signed and dated by all borrowers. It's got to be complete. If it's not complete, we've got to go back to the lender. It slows down the approval process. We've asked that lenders look at the application against the credit report. This is where borrowers slip up. They forget about the Bank of America card or the car loan or something. And so we're going to look at the credit report. We're going to look at the app. And so if the lender doesn't address it, then that, again, slows us down because we've got to go back to the lender and say, hey, what about this? And they tell us about deviations in that summary. We talked about this. We're looking at the site description and location of the project, the improvements, which is the building. Parking is a big deal because tenants in Alaska have toys. They want a place to put their boat. They want a place to put their second car. And so it has to have adequate parking. I mean, there's a zoning requirement. Zoning's a minimum. Doesn't mean that's the best for the market. So we look at parking. Soil conditions is mostly new construction. Geotechnical report takes care of that. If the building's there and the sheetrock's not all cracked, we figure the soils are good for it. Environmental assessment I talked about. Health and safety inspection I talked about. And we'd like the lender to go out and look at it. And so we like to know when they did that. Usually to reduce interruptions to the tenants, the lender goes out when the appraiser goes out or when the home inspector goes out. and that's also develops that rapport. It's really a positive thing, but it puts the lender's eyes, who's our eyes on the ground, in the property, so when they're making a recommendation to us that it's an acceptable risk to buy this loan, we know they've been out there and looked at it. And zoning is just a heads up. Like, again, I'm back to statute. It's not zoning compliant, and that's as of the date it was built, not today's zoning. If it's not zoning compliant, then that's got to be fixed. Most common, what we see there is mom and dad took a 2-bedroom and made it into 2 1-bedrooms, and now you have too many units for the footprint of the building or something like that. So that's just, the appraiser typically identifies that on the report, says it's either in compliance or not in compliance, and then we go back to the regulatory agency that does the zoning and get a determination letter. Property management is the ability to manage the property, i.e. whether it's an individual or a professional company. The income and expense, this is the nuts and bolts of it, is our operating statement. We look at the credit, I said. The underwriting is the underwriting of the file, and we're after safe, quality, affordable housing. It doesn't mean we can't finance or we won't finance stuff. It means that if there's a property that's been neglected, we'd like to see the financing used to bring that property up to standards for the safety of the occupants. This is the gist of our income underwriting. So you have gross potential rents. That's the market rents. That's what everybody pays. That's the number on the rental contract. You take a vacancy and credit loss factor out of there. It varies by community. I won't go below 5%, but Fairbanks has this wicked cyclic vacancy rate. Depends on who's in town. And so it averages around 10%. So you're going to see about a 10% on Fairbanks appraisals, depending on which brigade's in town, frankly. And so we rely on the appraiser to identify that. And so that comes off of rent. There's other income. I don't use laundry income because there's no way of telling what that number will be, though I recognize it's a true income source for a multifamily property. When I say other income, I'm looking like real estate. So garages, if you add $50 a month to rent a garage, or storage lockers, $25 a month, that's real income that I can count towards gross effective income. Okay? Yes?
I have a quick question.
Sure. Yes.
Is there a kind of standardized number out there that everybody will move on from
Yes. Labor produces the main stats from the rental market survey, which we republish.
Who does?
Department of Labor. And so that's republished. You guys do vacancy rates up here also on a quarterly report. It's a different survey mechanism. We rely on the appraiser to give us that number. And it's when they're putting this together in the appraisal report is where they list it, and then there'll be a narrative paragraph on how they determine that, citing their source, essentially.
Is that updated as needed or monthly or quarterly?
Technically, it's current with each appraisal report that we get. Our rental market survey comes out once a year, and that's what the Department of Labor does. Again, I think Fairbanks does it a little more frequently. Yeah, no. And so what's going to happen? Is that what's happening now? Is it 12? We've seen appraisal reports as high as 14 when 4,000 people leave all at once. It's temporary. They're supposed to be annualized rates. But I'm stuck with the appraisal report. Okay? And then so the appraiser is supposedly the professional third party that's telling me this information. Well, I don't want to second guess the appraiser, because then all my math on then I'm complying with statutes, that doing an 80% loan to value goes out the window. It all becomes subjective. I'm trying to keep this as objective as possible. So not that I'm aware of. It's the cost of construction. And then we have the expenses that are come out of the pro forma. And there's a management expense. Self-managed is the appraiser is still going to use a market-derived number, and it'll be 5% or so of the gross effective income. If you sign a contract, we're going to look at the contract with the property management company, 8%, 7%, or whatever the number is. That's the number that goes in there. Administrative expenses is like your telephone and other little small expenses. Usually that's 2% of property income. Insurance is whatever the quote is. For the property insurance, we require property replacement coverage as well as liability coverage. So basically a commercial policy. Taxes are taxes. Everybody knows what taxes are. I don't have to get into that. Utilities. Utilities are typically based on the schedulees from the prior owner. Sometimes an appraiser will call the utility companies for a specific property and get the actual numbers, but that's again a cost that goes in as an expense. Maintenance and repairs is very subjective because less scrupulous landlords cut there first and others fix everything. So again, we look at the schedulees to see what the historic maintenance expense is. I look for anywhere from 5 to 8% of income to go towards maintenance and repairs. And that's covering unit turns, basically. And then, of course, the replacement reserves, which is also designed to cover unit turns, which is, again, how we get paid. Because if the units are empty, you can't generate the cash to make the expenses in the mortgage payment. And that gives you your NOI, that net operating income figure. And as a percent of gross effective income, for market rate, it runs about 45%, 40 to 45%, maybe a little higher, depending on the operator and what they're spending their money on. So that gives you an idea. It takes about just a little less than half of what you're going to make just to run the building. And then the debt coverage ratio is the NOI divided by the P&I, and that's that 125 million. That's the magic of it right there. That's how we look at these and how we make the primary part of our determination on whether it's an acceptable risk. I said I'd beat this one up. The appraiser estimates reserves. It's for items that have a shorter economic life than the property. If I'm doing a 30-year loan, I know the stoves aren't going to last 30 years. I know the drapes aren't going to last 30 years. The carpet in the hallway is not going to last. So the idea here is that a little bit of money is set aside, typically 2 to 3% of the income. It goes into a capital account, and then when a unit turns or when there's a repair, we know the money's there for the individual to make that repair. So the property remains marketable, so the units remain occupied, so he or she can continue to make the loan payments. Otherwise, they have to skip a loan payment to fix the property, and then you have a delinquency. And so the reserves are there for the use of the owner to maintain the property so it remains marketable to the general public. We could require, that nasty carpet example I shared. We could say, you better put $2,500 in that account in case the tenant moves out tomorrow. That's rare. Typically, we don't do that. There is a 5-year cap on that. So the reserves, if you put 60 months of the reserve payment into that account, then the lender or the servicer is going to lower your payment until you draw on that account. Again, that's a personal financial decision. I don't see why they're not used more than they are, just because it's money that comes out of the cash flow that can go back into the property for capital improvements. If there's an early septic problem or something that's unanticipated, we do allow a draw, but then we have to recapture the funding for, it's like a soft loan technically. So we have to recapture the funding so when the appliances and drapes come time for repair, we know the money's there. And so that's another little tool for unanticipated capital expenses. So what am I talking about? I said it's the economic life, less than the loan term. The appraiser identifies these items. We look at appliances, roof coverings, floor coverings, but not in the unit. Not in the unit. The security deposit should cover the carpet in the unit. All right? I'm looking at common areas. HVAC boiler is a big one. Exterior common area paint, but not unit paint. Security deposit is supposed to cover that, or that 8% maintenance and repair item covers that. I can't do personal property with replacement reserves. So furniture doesn't work, new equipment, computers is a big one. We're going to buy them not with the replacement reserve money because that's identified at a specific level for a specific purpose. And not routine maintenance items. We get people that have to replace a zone valve and then they want their $150 back. That's abusing that process. It's not what it's there for. If you did 50 zone valves for a 50-unit building, okay, I could see that. But one, that's maintenance. Again, that's why there's 5 to 8% into the pro forma budget to cover that kind of expense. So how do we approve the loan? And I'm getting close. Appreciate everybody's patience. Any loan amount under $1.5 million is done internally with the executive loan committee. It takes us about 45 days from receipt of a complete application till we get that commitment out. If it's over $1.5 million, it goes to our board of directors, and there's some disclosure items there. Once it goes to the board of directors, that write-up that we do, the memo, is public information. Okay, so your customer needs to know that it becomes a public document when it goes before our board. And then there's the scheduling piece. Our board meets once a month, most of the time. Like nothing in December. They'll skip one in the early spring, maybe February or March, and maybe September or October. So you got to look at the board's schedule to determine the earliest when your loan file could get before our board, and I ask that we get 60 days advance notice of that. So that gives us time to process it, ask any questions, complete the file, and dress it up so it's prepared for our board review. Closing and shipping is how you get the file to us. Again, the disclosure. Tell the customer about reserves. Tell them about what to expect with their loan and how to deal with their servicing department. You got to read the commitment contract. The commitment contract has the terms and conditions in it that stipulate how you close the loan. I recommend you use a checklist. Just make a checklist if you're setting up this shop or you're working in this shop. Use a checklist to make sure that the items are covered. That's what we use, frankly, is checklists. And the proper execution of loan documents. So this famous limited liability company, right? Well, its authority comes from its managing member. And so I need the managing member as the managing member to sign, but then we also have a recourse note, so that individual also signs individually. And so that's what I mean about execution of loan documents. You can't just have a sole owner just signing once. He's got to sign for his company and himself. It's amazing the trouble we have with that. A purchase voucher, again, is the piece of contract that tells us how much you're expecting to be funded, and you're endorsing the note to Alaska Housing with the name and title of the authorized signer on that, because you're selling us the loan. Okay? Some other stuff, we do allow commercial space, but the primary function has to be residential. This is recent authority that's underutilized. One project that is using other financing, but comes to mind is, was mentioned, it's being done in Anchorage. It's retail on the first floor and apartments above it. I could finance the whole thing for forever until about 5 years ago. That was half Ada and half Alaska Housing, which was a nightmare. You had to make condo units and add $100,000 of soft costs to a project. Now Alaska Housing can do the whole thing. However, it has to be primarily residential. Legislature, in their kindness, didn't tell us what primarily residential meant, and so we sort of look at the project and look at maybe the square footage. If there's an extra square foot of residential space versus commercial, I can say that's primarily 50-50 is, the housing wouldn't be built, so it's primarily for the purpose of residential. So we have some latitude there to work. I'd love to see more of these projects. I think they do them outside. They do them effectively outside. Anybody's ever been to Portland and look at what they did down there with the retail and the residential above it, Alaska's behind the times, in my opinion. Again, I said zoning compliant. And another law, they can't be delinquent on child support, individuals. And so that's a sort of a disclosure thing, and you get the report. Taxes on the property have to be current. We don't like to finance delinquent property taxes. And when you think about it, 30-year fixed rate financing is not the best way to pay for an annual property tax. So it wouldn't make sense for us to support that habit. Again, first lien position only. No subordinate financing under this program. And when we get copies of tax returns, they have to be signed. A lot of times they come in with just the CPA stamp on them. We like them to be signed because that's prudent lending. So in a nutshell, all this means the lender prepares a complete file, submits the loan package to Alaska Housing following our checklist. We issue the commitment contract. That's the promise to buy the loan under specific commitment and terms. The lender then closes the loan and ships the loan for us to purchase. We wire net funds, so any fees and costs are netted out of the principal that we're wiring back to the lending bank. And then the servicer services the loan. That's the 30 years happily ever after that I was talking about. And again, lender disclosure, lender disclosure, lender disclosure. Be up front with your customers so they know what to expect when it comes time for our servicing partners to work it. That's who we are. That's myself and my staff. Contact us with any questions. We're happy to answer questions. I mean, that's why we're there, to answer questions. You can use email. I like email because, remember I told you if you're doing new construction, you're going to start a file, an email gives you a written answer. You print that email, and we all like to employ lumberjacks, so we're not worried about that. And so you print the email, and then you have a written answer from Alaska Housing on your question. So that's why I encourage email, but a phone call is always good too, and we're happy to answer any questions. Any other questions about how Alaska Housing may be helped? Yes?
Oh, I was just going to add to the project characteristics of parking. You might want to add place for snow.
Absolutely, great point. Snow storage is huge because what happens if there's no room for snow storage? You got to pay the guy with a front end loader to come and take it off, right? Otherwise, there's no parking. And and that's an expense that's not typically underwritten. That's a great point. Thank you. Snow storage is huge. Yes. Yes, but you'll be required to get flood insurance. Federal flood insurance. Jeff?
In the example of the, where you said commercial spaces allow property multifamily.
Yes.
So, a multifamily use, does the, commercial property count towards the residential?
Yes. But it's underwritten differently. So typically, commercial businesses have a higher vacancy, for instance. For whatever reason, retail, or what we see sometimes is businesses that are available for the general public, like a hair salon or something like that. Like if you do an elderly, and they want the hair salon for the general public, the revenue stream is underwritten a little more conservatively, but we do count that revenue. And again, the appraiser is going to look at how comparable hair salon shops operate and have those numbers and tell us what to expect. Yes.
These are all fairly new programs, right?
The authority to finance commercial space is relatively new, and that energy program is new, but the multifamily loan purchase program has been around since late 90s.
So are you anticipating more, do you have an estimate of how many you should be building? Yes.
Oh, the unit question? That's market driven, and so the military has their version of how many units they need. In my opinion, I have to be careful again. The market is different than the standards that the military has for their service people. And so what they're looking at, when we went through this before, 10 years ago, and I was involved with that, I'm involved with this, is they're looking for larger units, square footage wise, than what the market typically supports. And so that creates a subjective approach to how many units we actually need. And so what we do is we look at what the market, remember I'm underwriting the market. I'm not underwriting super manager A or low manager Z and their demands and abilities. I'm looking at what the demographic population in the market lives in and what is out there as comparables. And so the short answer is no, I don't have any idea of how many units Fairbanks needs. I can offer that I think Fairbanks has an older housing stock and could benefit greatly from rehabilitation to some of the projects that are out there.
Yeah. Do you anticipate
More units?
Yeah.
Oh, loan volume for us? A little bit. Not. It comes down to that conundrum of the cost to build and add inventory versus what it's worth and how you finance the gap. And so if you don't have investors, meaning owners, that are willing to put forward that capital and get their rate of return on that capital over time through the cash flow of the property, it's not going to happen. And so what we're trying to do is make sure everybody's aware of the financing programs we have available, and we expect the people to respond to the demand for more units, but we're not quite sure how it's going to play out yet. I don't think anybody does. Mhm. Jim.
You said that, you would, in terms of overhousing. We have more housing than we need. What do you base that on?
I believe my comment was that the military has a standard that exceeds the market. The size of their units predominantly is larger than what's supported by the private sector. And an example is when they say they need X number of 2-bedroom or 3-bedroom apartments, they're saying X number at 1,200 square feet. Well, and that's my number, not theirs, but what the market supports is 800 to 900 square feet. And so what I saw before when we ramped up here was that the standards were different, and that miscommunication of standards created more concern, because last time the market kind of absorbed everything. Well, you didn't have a lot of new construction, except what we did on base. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Correct. Right. Correct. To us, absolutely. That's the market study that I was talking about. You're looking at the market demographics and where people want to live, what's available, the inventory, and determining what the shortfall of units is to address that population increase. That's correct. I agree. That's correct. That sounds like an absolutely valuable tool for the process. I agree. No pressure, Jeff. On that point, it's typically cheaper to rehabilitate, and I agree with you fully that sometimes properties aren't worth it. That's an economic analysis, but it's cheaper to rehab than build new. And that's something that I think this community could benefit from, personally speaking, is look at some of the older inventory and leverage those resources, and frankly with some of our longer term financing programs, and we carry the risk on it. But that would be one tool that's more bang for the buck.